The wedding ring felt more like a shackle than a promise. I had just turned 18, and instead of celebrating freedom, I found myself bound to a man I barely knew, a man everyone whispered about, admired, and feared. His name was Ethan Caldwell, the alpha architect whose designs reshaped Manhattan, whose icy demeanor kept even his closest associates at a distance. He wasn't the kind of man you married out of love. You married him because it was arranged, because family politics left no room for choice, or because in my case you were an omega born into expectations too heavy to escape. I remember the first time I stood beside him at the altar. The cold marble church, the suffocating fragrance of white lilies, the press of cameras capturing our union like it was some business contract. He didn't look at me, not once. His gaze stayed fixed on the priest, his jawline sharp enough to slice through the silence. My heart, on the other hand, wouldn't stop pounding. Not from love, no. I wasn't that naive, but from fear. Fear that my life had just ended before it could even begin. People say love stories begin with sparks, with butterflies, with stolen glances. Mine began with chains. The first weeks were unbearable. Ethan barely spoke to me, only issuing polite nods or clipped answers. We lived in his sleek glass-walled penthouse overlooking Central Park, a place too large and too empty, where his footsteps echoed down the hall like reminders of distance. I ate alone most nights. My presence seemed to irritate him, though he never said it outright. Instead, it was in the way his shoulders tensed when I entered a room, the way his eyes flickered away when mine tried to meet his. And yet, for all his coldness, Ethan wasn't cruel. He never raised his voice. He never insulted me. He simply shut me out, as if I were some fragile piece of furniture forced into his carefully curated home. But one thing about being an omega: silence can suffocate you, and loneliness burns hotter than rejection. It was a rainy night in late October when things shifted. I had fallen asleep on the living room couch, exhaustion pulling me under after hours of trying to study for college exams. When I woke, the storm outside raged, lightning flashing against the glass walls. My body shook uncontrollably. It wasn't fear. It was instinct. My nature responding to the weather, my omega heart craving warmth. I didn't realize Ethan had returned home. Not until I felt a weight drape across me, a heavy, tailored coat, warm from his body. Startled, I sat up. He stood there, hair damp from the rain, tie loosened, eyes unreadable. "You'll catch a cold," he said simply, his voice low, steady. It was the first time he had addressed me without indifference. And in that moment, something inside me cracked open. Days after that night, I began to notice subtle changes. He'd leave a cup of coffee on the counter for me in the mornings, black for him, sweetened just right for me. He'd adjust the thermostat slightly warmer, though he never admitted it was for my comfort. He even started coming home earlier, not every night, but enough for me to notice. Still, walls remained between us. I wanted to break them, but I didn't know how. Until one evening when I wandered into his study. His desk was covered with sketches, blueprints of buildings that seemed to defy gravity. But one caught my eye. It wasn't a skyscraper. It wasn't even a house. It was a garden, sprawling, intricate, filled with paths and hidden corners, designed not for business but for peace. I touched the edge of the paper, reverently. "This is beautiful," I whispered, forgetting he was even there. Ethan looked up sharply from across the room. His eyes, usually guarded, softened just a fraction. "It's something I started years ago, never finished." "Why not?" "Because some things aren't meant to exist." His tone was final, but his gaze lingered on me, as though the garden wasn't the only unfinished thing in his life. That night I couldn't sleep. For the first time, I saw Ethan not as the cold alpha everyone believed him to be, but as a man carrying secrets, regrets, and unspoken desires. And against all reason, my heart ached for him. But love, or whatever fragile seed was sprouting between us, doesn't bloom without struggle. And ours would face storms far beyond the weather. The news broke a week later. A tabloid headline: "Cruel and merciless. Billionaire architect's scandalous marriage to teen omega." They dug into everything: my age, my family's debts, the suspicion that this marriage was nothing more than a transaction. I became a target, painted as a gold digger, a pawn. My classmates whispered behind my back. Strangers sent hate online. And Ethan? He reacted as expected, with silence. At least that's what I thought. Until one evening, when I came home to find him pacing the living room, phone clutched tightly in his hand, his usual composure shattered. "They won't stop," he muttered, anger lacing his words. "Your name, your face, they're tearing you apart." I had never seen him like that. His voice low but trembling, his hands clenched as though he wanted to destroy the world just to protect me. I stepped closer, hesitant. "Why do you care?" His eyes met mine, burning with something I couldn't decipher. "Because you're my husband." The word struck me like lightning. Husband. Not pawn. Not burden. Husband. I didn't know it then, but that moment marked the beginning of everything. Ethan's words that night haunted me. "Because you're my husband." It wasn't a confession. It wasn't even tender. But it was the first time he had acknowledged me as more than an arrangement, more than an inconvenience. Yet the world outside our glass-walled penthouse didn't care about private truths. The storm of gossip only grew. Paparazzi followed me to school, cameras flashing as if my life were a scandal to devour. Professors grew uneasy. Classmates whispered louder. I tried to hold my head high, but every step felt heavier. Ethan noticed. He wasn't blind. Slowly, his presence shifted from distant guardian to quiet protector. He would drive me himself, his black car shielding me from the frenzy of flashing bulbs. He spoke to lawyers, threatening lawsuits against the tabloids. But the cruelest wounds weren't from strangers, they were from people I thought were friends. One afternoon, after a brutal day of snide remarks and mocking laughter, I found myself sitting on the steps of campus, shivering despite the spring air. I didn't cry, though my chest ached with the weight of humiliation. Ethan's car pulled up. He didn't speak as I slid into the seat, but his hand, steady and warm, brushed briefly against mine. Just a moment, just enough to keep me from breaking. "Tell me you want to leave it all behind," he said finally, eyes fixed on the road. "And I'll take you anywhere." The words stunned me. They weren't the Ethan everyone knew. They weren't the words of a cold alpha. They were raw, almost desperate. But I shook my head. "I don't want to run. Not if it means running from you." For the first time, his lips curved into something fragile, something that looked like hope. Still, love never comes without tests. The hardest came weeks later, when Ethan's estranged father returned. A powerful man, ruthless in business and reputation. He despised me at first glance. "This marriage is a stain," he said, his voice sharp, cutting across Ethan's office. "You tied yourself to a boy who brings nothing but scandal. End it before it destroys you." I stood there, trembling, as Ethan's father delivered his verdict. I expected silence from Ethan, expected him to retreat into the safety of indifference. But instead, Ethan rose slowly, his hands pressed flat on the desk, his voice steady but filled with fire. "You may control the company," he said, "but you will not control my life. He is my husband. That will not change." The words hung in the air like a declaration, bold and irrevocable. My heart hammered in my chest, my throat tight with unspoken emotion. In that moment, I realized Ethan wasn't just protecting me. He was choosing me. But the world doesn't forgive easily. Rumors escalated into threats. One night, after leaving class, I was cornered in an alley by strangers whose faces I never saw clearly. Shouts, shoves, the flash of a knife. My shoulder burned with pain, and I stumbled, terrified. When I woke in the hospital, Ethan was at my side, his hands gripping mine so tightly his knuckles whitened. His eyes were red, his jaw tense, but his voice broke when he spoke. "I almost lost you," he whispered. I can't lose you." I wanted to speak, to reassure him, but my throat caught. All I could do was squeeze his hand weakly. He leaned closer, pressing his forehead against mine, and for the first time his walls shattered. "I love you," he confessed, voice hoarse, shaking with the weight of words long buried. I fought it. I told myself I didn't. But I do. God, I do. Tears slid down my cheeks, but they weren't from pain. They were from the truth that finally surfaced between us. I love you too, I whispered, fragile but certain. Recovery was slow, but love filled the empty spaces pain had carved. Ethan became different, not entirely, never untrue to himself, but softer where it mattered. He laughed, quietly, when I teased him. He listened when I spoke of dreams, even the small ones, like wanting to plant herbs on the balcony or learning to cook a dish from my childhood. And one evening, he led me to his study, to that unfinished garden design. I want to build it, he said. Not for clients. For us. It wasn't just a drawing anymore. It became reality. Over the next year, we carved out a hidden place on the outskirts of the city, where flowers bloomed and stone paths wound through trees. A sanctuary. A promise made of earth and sky. Standing in that garden, my hand in his, I realized that what had begun as a chain had transformed into something else entirely. A bond, yes, but one chosen, one nurtured. The night of our anniversary, snow began to fall over New York. We walked together down a quiet street, his arm brushing mine, our breath visible in the cold. People still stared sometimes, still whispered, but it didn't matter anymore. We had endured storms fiercer than gossip, wounds deeper than words. Ethan stopped under a street lamp, snow catching in his dark hair. He looked at me with that rare, unguarded tenderness, and his hand finally, deliberately intertwined with mine. You saved me, he said softly. I shook my head. No. We saved each other. And there, in the silence of winter, surrounded by a city that once tried to tear us apart, we kissed. Not out of duty, not out of survival, but out of love, the kind that endures, the kind that heals, the kind that finally makes you whole. Because in the end, our story wasn't about contracts or gossip, not even about the labels of Alpha and Omega. It was about two souls finding each other in a world determined to keep them apart, and always choosing to hold on. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe to stay updated with the latest videos.